On a warm, quiet morning, in a small village nestled among rolling hills, something was about to happen that would change everything. A local farmer, who had just finished his morning chores, was walking back home when he noticed something unusual near the edge of the woods. At first, he thought it was a bundle of cloth, maybe something discarded by someone passing through. But as he took a few steps closer, his heart skipped a beat. There, lying motionless in the dirt, was an infant. The baby, no more than a few months old, was wrapped loosely in a torn piece of fabric. Its small body looked fragile, and it was breathing weakly, almost as if it was fighting to stay alive. The farmer's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The infant's skin appeared pale and blotchy, and there was something odd about the way it was lying. The farmer immediately knew something was terribly wrong. Without wasting any time, he rushed forward and gently scooped the baby up into his arms. His thoughts raced. Who would leave a helpless infant like this? The baby was in no condition to be alone, and it seemed to be suffering from something more than just neglect. The farmer carefully cradled the baby and rushed back toward the village, his heart pounding in his chest. He called out for help as he ran, hoping someone would know what to do. Within minutes, the word spread, and a group of concerned villagers gathered. Some of them recognized the baby, but no one knew where it had come from or why it had been abandoned in such a dangerous place. People whispered in fear, wondering if this was some sort of sign. It wasn't every day that something so shocking happened in their peaceful village. Someone suggested they should call the local authorities, and others quickly agreed. As the villagers gathered around, the baby was handed over to a group of women who were skilled in taking care of young children. They tried to comfort the baby, but it was clear that it was in distress. Its small body was trembling, and it cried softly, as though it had already endured so much. The villagers knew they had to act fast, so one of the women, who had experience with emergency situations, rushed to fetch the local doctor. Meanwhile, others tried to keep the baby warm, wrapping it in fresh cloths. The moment they saw the baby's strange condition, with skin that seemed almost too pale, some of the villagers began to wonder if it had been abandoned due to an illness. Was the baby sick? Had something happened to it that no one could explain? Soon, the doctor arrived, and after a quick examination, he told the villagers that the situation was worse than they thought. The baby was covered in strange, red welts, some of which were swollen and seemed to be filled with something. The doctor immediately recognized the symptoms. This was not a simple sickness. The baby had been infected by something much more serious. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the doctor instructed the villagers to call for a rescue team immediately. This was no longer just a case of abandonment. It was a medical emergency. The baby needed help, and the sooner they got professional care, the better its chances of surviving. As the villagers watched the baby being carefully placed in a transport basket to be taken away, they all felt a mixture of fear and hope. They could only pray that the child would survive whatever infection had taken hold of it. The baby's story was just beginning, and its journey to survival would be nothing short of a miracle. The rescue team arrived quickly, their vehicle kicking up dust as it pulled into the village. It was a small, tight-knit community, so when something serious happened, everyone knew about it. The sight of the team made the villagers feel a little more hopeful, though there was still an air of uncertainty hanging over them. No one knew exactly what had caused the baby's condition, but the fact that they now had a team of professionals ready to help made everyone breathe a little easier. The rescue team was made up of medical experts, including a doctor, a nurse, and a paramedic. They had been called in after the doctor had assessed the baby's condition, realizing that immediate medical attention was needed. The team wasted no time. They gathered around the baby, who was still wrapped in the cloth the farmer had used to carry it. One of the team members carefully checked the infant's pulse, while the others started preparing medical supplies. The baby's face was pale, and its body felt cold to the touch. The team's nurse gently cleaned the infant's skin, trying to assess the full extent of the swelling and unusual marks. The welts on the baby's body were unlike anything they had seen before. The doctor, already growing concerned, noticed that the marks were oddly shaped, almost as though something had burrowed into the baby's skin. The nurse gently felt the bumps, trying to determine whether they were filled with fluid or something else. The baby stirred slightly but didn't cry out. Its small body trembled as if it was in pain. The team exchanged worried glances, realizing just how serious the situation was. They knew that whatever was happening to the baby, it was urgent. Time was running out, and they needed to act quickly. The team decided that the baby had to be transported to the nearest hospital for more advanced care. A paramedic carefully placed the baby into an infant-sized transport unit and strapped it in securely. As the team began to make their way back to their vehicle, one of the villagers spoke up, asking what they thought had caused the baby's condition. The doctor replied, "We believe it could be some sort of parasitic infection. It's rare, but it's something we need to look into." His words hung in the air, leaving the villagers in stunned silence. No one had expected anything like this to happen, and the thought of parasites being the cause sent a shiver down everyone's spine. As the rescue team loaded the baby into their vehicle and sped off toward the hospital, the villagers stayed behind, anxiously watching them disappear into the distance. The community was left to ponder what could have happened to the baby and how it had ended up in such a horrible condition. Everyone hoped for the best, but in their hearts, they all feared the worst. The baby had a long road ahead of it, and it would need all the strength it could muster to survive. The rescue team, now on their way to the hospital, didn't have time to dwell on the unsettling nature of the case. They had to focus on keeping the baby alive. The medical team spoke quietly among themselves, already preparing for the challenging task that lay ahead. They knew that the next few hours would be crucial in determining whether the baby could survive the infection that had taken hold of its tiny body. The stakes were high, and they couldn't afford to waste a single moment. As the team made their way to the hospital, they couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The baby's condition was still critical, and the team had to prepare for whatever they might find once they arrived. The doctor and nurse exchanged worried glances, both aware that this was not a simple case. They had dealt with a variety of medical emergencies, but this was different. Something about the baby's condition felt strange and dangerous. When they arrived at the hospital, the team wasted no time. The doctors and nurses quickly took charge, moving the baby onto an examination table. The room was filled with hushed voices as everyone tried to assess the severity of the situation. The baby's body was covered with welts and strange markings, and the medical staff could see how the infection had spread quickly. The doctor, who had been with the team, carefully examined the welts on the baby's skin, his brow furrowed in concentration. One of the nurses gently wiped away some of the swelling around the baby's neck and shoulders, revealing a deeper layer of infected skin. It was unlike anything they had seen before, dark and discolored, with tiny, almost invisible puncture marks all over the surface. The doctor carefully examined the welts with a magnifying glass. His face grew more serious as he took in the sight. "This is no ordinary infection," he said quietly. "I've seen cases of skin rashes, even insect bites. But this is something different." He turned to the nurse. "We need to run tests immediately. We're dealing with something far worse than we thought." The nurse nodded and quickly started gathering the necessary tools to conduct a series of tests. Meanwhile, the doctor continued to examine the baby's condition, gently feeling the swollen areas to see if there was any fluid buildup or infection beneath the surface. As he worked, he muttered to himself, clearly trying to make sense of what was happening. After several tense minutes, the nurse returned with the necessary equipment, and they began taking samples from the baby's skin. The baby, though weak, still managed to let out faint cries as the medical team worked. The cries were heartbreaking, but the doctors knew they couldn't waste time on comforting the child. They had to figure out what was causing the infection before it spread any further. The test results came back within an hour, and they confirmed the team's fears. The baby had been infected with honeycomb parasites, an incredibly rare and dangerous condition. These parasites were unlike typical bugs or insects. They laid their larvae under the skin, creating a network of tiny interconnected sacs that fed off the host's body. The larvae grew rapidly and caused intense swelling, making it difficult for the body to heal. It was a dangerous infection that needed immediate treatment to prevent further harm. The team immediately began preparing the necessary medication to combat the parasite. They had dealt with many infections before, but this one was new to them. And the challenge was immense. The doctor explained that the treatment would require strong antibiotics, along with topical treatments to manage the swelling and prevent any further infection from spreading. As they worked, the room became tense with anticipation. They knew the baby was fighting for its life, but they also knew that if they didn't act fast, the infection could continue to spread. The doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, determined to do everything they could to save the baby. The tiny infant had already been through so much, and now it was up to the medical team to give it a fighting chance. As the minutes ticked by, the medical team continued to work tirelessly, knowing that the baby's survival depended on their every move. The baby's condition was fragile, and despite the medication being administered, there were still signs of distress. The swelling from the parasitic infection was severe, making it difficult for the baby to breathe properly. Its small chest rose and fell unevenly, as if struggling with every breath. The doctors and nurses knew that time was their most precious ally, and the pressure to act quickly weighed heavily on them. The doctor, a seasoned professional, glanced at the clock and then at the baby's vitals. They were stable for the moment, but he knew that could change at any time. The honeycomb parasites were relentless and moved quickly, burrowing deeper into the skin, affecting the baby's health in a way no one had anticipated. The doctor took a deep breath and turned to the nurse, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to administer another round of antibiotics. If we don't stop the parasites now, it might be too late." The nurse nodded and quickly prepared the injections. They were strong, designed to kill the parasites and slow down the infection. As she administered the medication, the baby let out another faint cry, but the team pressed on. They had no choice. The baby's cries were heartbreaking, but they knew they couldn't afford to stop. Every second counted. Outside the room, the hospital was quiet, the waiting area filled with anxious faces. The villagers who had followed the rescue team's arrival were huddled together, whispering in quiet tones. They had heard about the parasitic infection, but the reality of it was far worse than anyone had imagined. There was an undercurrent of hope in the air, though. Everyone was praying for the baby, hoping that the medical team could pull through. Back in the room, the doctor continued his careful examination of the baby's skin. The welts were still swollen, but there was a slight change in the texture of the skin. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a glimmer of hope. The parasites seemed to be slowing down. "Good," he whispered to himself. "We're making progress." But the battle was far from over. The medication had begun to work, but it would take time for the parasites to be fully eradicated. The baby's tiny body was fighting against the infection, but it needed more than just medicine. It needed strength. The team decided to keep the baby under close observation for the next few hours, monitoring its vitals and ensuring the infection didn't worsen. It was a delicate balance, and every change in the baby's condition sent a ripple of tension through the room. The doctor and the nurse took turns watching over the baby, while the paramedic kept the equipment running smoothly. Despite the uncertainty of the situation, there was a sense of quiet determination in the room. The medical team knew they couldn't give up. They had seen many patients fight for their lives, but there was something about this baby, a sense of vulnerability that made them push even harder. They weren't just fighting for the baby's survival, they were fighting for its future, for the chance to give it a life beyond the pain and suffering it had already endured. As the hours passed, the baby's condition seemed to stabilize a little more. The swelling had started to decrease slightly, and the baby's breathing became a bit more even. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The medical team shared a brief moment of relief, knowing that they were heading in the right direction, but they all understood that the real challenge was far from over. As the days passed, the medical team continued their relentless work to save the infant. The baby had been in critical condition since its arrival at the hospital, but now there were signs of hope. Slowly, the swelling began to subside, and the tiny body that had once been so fragile was now showing a bit of strength. The relief was palpable, but the team remained cautious, knowing that the battle was far from over. The doctor and nurses monitored the baby's condition closely, making sure the parasitic infection didn't return or worsen. The antibiotics and treatments had worked, but the team was aware that the baby's immune system was still weak from the ordeal. It was going to take time for the little one to regain its strength, and no one was willing to let their guard down. The baby, though still weak, was starting to show signs of responsiveness. It no longer had the labored breathing that had been a constant concern, and its cries had become a little stronger. This small change was enough to bring a sense of hope to the medical staff. They had been worried about the possibility of long-term damage, but now they were cautiously optimistic that the baby would recover fully. During these long days in the hospital, the medical team worked together seamlessly, each person focused on the task at hand. The nurse had become especially close to the baby, often sitting by the bed, gently stroking its tiny hand and talking to it softly, trying to comfort it in any way she could. There was something about the baby's innocence that tugged at her heart, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility for its well-being. Though the worst seemed to be over, the doctors and nurses knew they still needed to keep a close eye on the baby. They couldn't afford to take any chances. The honeycomb parasite had already done enough damage, and the team was determined to make sure it didn't cause any lasting effects. Tests were run frequently to check for any signs of lingering infection, and the baby was given everything it needed to heal. The villagers, who had been anxiously waiting for news, were overjoyed to hear about the baby's recovery. Word had spread quickly, and the community had rallied behind the child, praying for its survival. When the news broke that the baby was getting better, the entire village breathed a sigh of relief. It was a moment of triumph for everyone, especially for the brave rescue team that had stepped in at the right moment. As the baby continued to improve, the question on everyone's mind was how it had come to be abandoned in the first place. The authorities had launched an investigation into the circumstances, but there were still no clear answers. Who would leave such a helpless child in the woods, exposed to the dangers of the wild? The mystery surrounding the baby's abandonment remained unsolved, but the focus was now on its survival and recovery. Over the next few days, the baby continued to gain strength. It was still too early to know what kind of future the child would have, but the medical team remained hopeful. They had seen many children overcome incredible odds, and they were determined to help this baby do the same. As the baby grew stronger, the staff began to discuss what would happen next. The community had shown great concern for the child, and it seemed that there were already talks of adoption. The baby had been through so much, and now it needed a loving home where it could continue to heal and thrive. The medical team, while proud of the progress, knew their part in the journey was coming to an end. It was time for the next chapter in the baby's life to begin. As the baby's health continued to improve, the community began to ask the most pressing question: who was responsible for abandoning the child in the woods? The villagers had seen the baby, helpless and struggling for life, and now they were desperate to know how it ended up in such a dangerous situation. The authorities were investigating, and a sense of unease spread throughout the village. No one could understand why someone would leave a defenseless infant in the wild, especially in the condition the baby had been found in. The local authorities had been in touch with the police, who launched a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding the baby's abandonment. They combed through the woods near where the baby had been found, looking for any clues that might point to the person responsible. They also spoke to locals, hoping to gather any information that could lead them to the truth. But despite all their efforts, there were no clear answers. No one had witnessed the abandonment, and no one knew anything about the baby's background. The villagers speculated and whispered, but there was no solid evidence that could explain the baby's presence in the woods. It was as if the infant had appeared out of nowhere. Some villagers even wondered if the baby had been left by someone from outside the village, someone who had come to town and left the baby behind without anyone noticing. The mystery surrounding the baby's origins only deepened with each passing day. It was clear that whoever had left the baby didn't want to be found, and the investigation stalled. But the community didn't give up on the child. The villagers had come together in ways that no one had expected, rallying behind the baby's survival. And now, as the baby grew stronger, they began to think about what would happen next. Though the investigation into the abandonment had hit a dead end, the village decided to focus on what mattered most: the baby's future. The local adoption services were contacted, and discussions began about the possibility of finding the child a permanent home. The villagers were determined to ensure that the baby would not suffer again. They were ready to embrace the child with open arms, offering it the love and care it needed to grow up healthy and happy. The medical staff, who had spent so much time and effort caring for the baby, began to discuss the next steps for the child as well. The nurses had grown attached to the infant, having watched it fight for survival. They knew that the baby needed a stable, loving environment to truly heal and thrive. Several families from the village had already expressed interest in adopting the child, and there was a quiet sense of optimism that the baby would soon have a bright future ahead. The doctor, who had overseen much of the baby's recovery, sat with the head nurse and the hospital director. They discussed the child's progress, noting that the baby was now feeding well, growing stronger every day, and showing signs of emotional development. The baby no longer appeared as frail as it had been when it first arrived, and its skin, once covered in swelling, had cleared up. There was still much to be done, but the baby had passed the most dangerous stages of its illness. The doctor spoke with confidence about the child's future, acknowledging that while the past few weeks had been filled with uncertainty, the future was looking far brighter. As the days went by, the community's focus shifted from the mystery of the abandonment to the baby's healing journey. Though the question of who had left the infant in the woods remained unanswered, the village had come together in ways that no one had expected. And for the baby, this newfound sense of community and love was exactly what it needed to continue to heal. As the baby's health improved day by day, a sense of relief spread throughout the village. It had been a long, hard journey, but the little one was now stronger and more vibrant than anyone had dared hope just a few weeks ago. The once weak infant who had fought so fiercely against the infection was now thriving in the care of the hospital staff and the loving attention of the villagers. Word of the baby's recovery had reached far and wide, and the community, once filled with uncertainty and fear, now exuded a feeling of warmth and unity. The hospital had become a place of hope, where not only the baby's life had been saved, but where something deeper had been fostered, a collective sense of compassion that tied the villagers together. They had all witnessed the infant's suffering and survival, and it brought them closer as they worked together to give the baby the best future possible. As the baby's condition stabilized, the village began to turn its focus to the next step: finding the child a permanent home. The adoption process was complicated, and the hospital staff took great care in making sure the baby would be placed with a family who could provide the stability, love, and care it needed. The emotional attachment the medical team had developed with the baby made the decision harder, but they all knew that the child needed a fresh start in a nurturing environment, far from the trauma it had endured. Several families expressed interest in adopting the child, and it wasn't long before a couple from a nearby town came forward. They had been waiting for a child to adopt for years, and the moment they heard about the baby, they knew it was meant to be. The couple, warm and kind, had a deep love for children, and they seemed like the perfect fit to give the baby a new life. They visited the hospital frequently, getting to know the baby and ensuring that they could provide the stable, loving home that the child deserved. Though the idea of letting the baby go was bittersweet for the hospital staff, they understood that this was what was best for the child. The baby had endured so much already, and now it was time for a new chapter to begin. The nurses and doctors spent hours with the family, making sure they had everything they needed to care for the baby, from basic needs to more specialized instructions. The family was eager to do whatever it took to ensure the baby's well-being and make sure the child felt safe and loved in their new home. Before the adoption was finalized, the village threw a small celebration to honor the baby's incredible recovery. It was a joyous occasion, filled with laughter, songs, and plenty of food. The villagers gathered together to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another for the child. It was a time to reflect on how the community had come together to support a life that, at first, seemed lost. Everyone who had played a role in the baby's survival, from the farmer who had found the infant to the rescue team, doctors, nurses, and the loving adoptive parents, was celebrated for their contribution to the miracle of the baby's life. As the day of the adoption finally arrived, the hospital staff prepared to say their goodbyes. The baby, now alert and curious, seemed ready for this new journey. The staff couldn't help but smile as they handed the child over to the waiting parents, knowing that the baby's future was now filled with promise. The couple looked at each other, their eyes filled with gratitude and determination to provide the love the baby needed. The journey had been long and difficult, but the little one was finally in a place where it could grow, heal, and thrive. As the couple left the hospital with their new child in their arms, the entire village stood outside, waving goodbye and wishing them well. The baby's story had come full circle, from being abandoned and fighting for survival to now being embraced by a loving family that would help it create a future full of love and opportunity. The village, forever changed by the experience, would continue to hold the baby's memory close. It had reminded them of the power of community, of love, and of resilience, the very things that had saved the life of a child who had once been left with nothing. As the days turned into weeks, the baby began to settle into its new home. The couple who had adopted the child poured their love and attention into every detail of the baby's care. Their home, once quiet and empty, now felt alive with the soft sounds of the infant's laughter and coos. Every little milestone, from the first smile to the first sound, was a reminder of the incredible journey this child had already endured. The village, though distant from the baby's new home, had not forgotten the little one. Word spread that the child was thriving, and the community felt a deep sense of satisfaction and relief, knowing that the baby was no longer just a survivor. It was now growing in a warm, loving environment. Every so often, the couple would return to the village with their adopted child, showing off the baby's progress and giving the villagers a chance to see how far the little one had come. The hospital staff who had cared for the baby would smile with pride, knowing their hard work had made this new life possible. The investigation into the abandonment had eventually slowed, but there was still no concrete answer about why the baby had been left in the woods. The authorities had been unable to trace any leads, and the mystery remained unsolved. However, in many ways, the villagers had found peace in not knowing. The baby's survival and the way the community had come together to support it had become the true story. What mattered now was not the past, but the future. As time went on, the baby, now growing into a happy toddler, started to show a vibrant personality. The child loved to explore, reaching out with tiny hands to touch everything in sight. There was a spark in its eyes that captivated everyone around it. The couple, grateful for every moment, made sure the baby had everything it needed to grow strong, both physically and emotionally. They provided a safe and nurturing environment, one that was full of love and security. The community, still closely connected to the couple, continued to play a role in the child's life. They would drop by to visit, bringing small gifts and offering words of encouragement. The bond between the child and the village was unbreakable. There was a sense of unity in the air, as the community celebrated not just the baby's survival, but its flourishing future. It was a reminder to everyone that no one was ever truly alone. As the years passed, the child became a symbol of hope and resilience. People would often talk about the infant that had been abandoned and left for dead, only to be rescued and nurtured by a community that refused to give up. The story had inspired many, reminding them of the importance of kindness, compassion, and the power of coming together for the greater good. One day, when the child was a bit older, the couple decided it was time to share the full story with them. They sat down and told the child about how they had found them and the long road they had traveled to make sure the baby was safe and healthy. The child, now old enough to understand, listened intently, their wide eyes absorbing every word. The couple made sure the story was told with love, emphasizing how much the community had cared for them, even before they became a part of their new family. The child smiled, knowing that they were loved beyond measure. And in that moment, it was clear to everyone who had been part of this journey. This baby, once abandoned and alone, was now surrounded by love, a community, and a family that would forever protect and cherish them. The baby's story was no longer just one of survival. It was a testament to the power of love and the strength that comes when people come together to make a difference.